Now, 2025 has seen countries across Africa hold dynamic and sometimes violent elections as political interests vie for position. We now reflect on the year that was on the continent, with transitions of power occurring with varying degrees of democracy and some at the barrel of a gun. We're joined by political campaign expert Dr. Ndou, CEO of the Southern Africa Times, Farai, Muvuti, and international relations analyst Dr. Charles Sinkala and Professor Chris Isike. Gentlemen, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Prof. Chris Isike, I want to start the conversation with you. 2024 was a busy year on the electoral calendar on the continent, but 2025 was no less busy. I mean, just fixating our attention on Tanzania is enough to make up for all of what was 2024. But we've seen a particular pattern in terms of electoral outcomes across 2024, and that is that legacy parties and/or liberation movements seem to have been losing power. Is that a sort of electoral sentiment that has sustained itself across 2025?
Good evening, Oliver, and to the panelists. Thank you for having me. Yes, you're correct that liberation parties that have become dominant parties, in their countries. In 2024, we saw that many of them tended to lose ground in several countries across the continent, especially in Southern Africa. And I think that we've seen some kind of response to that by some of these political parties to hang on to power by hook or crook. That's what explains some of the violence, post-election violence, crackdown on, opposition, as well as, even citizens that are protesting election results in many of these countries. And there's a sense in which we can also ask the question of the influence of democratic backsliding in the U.S., in terms of the implication of all of that for some of the electoral outcomes that we're seeing in the continent.
Yeah, let's talk about perhaps what were the most concerning election on the continent. And many would say it is the holding on by political ancients and dynasties that seem to be unwilling to leave power, Paul Biya being one of those. Prof. Ndou, Dr. Ndou, perhaps to ask you about that. What seems to be the reluctance on part of some African countries to allow for and welcome in a newer, refreshed and more energized politics rather than what seems to be a dated, antiquated politics with leaders that are as old as the politics?
Okay, so good evening and thank you so much for having me on the show. It's a complex question because there are a number of factors and they interlock from the kinds of political systems that are there across the continent to the kind of legal infrastructure, to the kind of authoritarian tactics that are used to consolidate power and to entrench power across the continent, including the use of military actors and patterns across the continent of anti-constitutionalism. So it's not really one factor, but it's a host of factors. And the through line across it is weak institutional systems and a culture of strong men on the continent. This also combines with the extent to which citizens feel disengaged, disempowered, and we see this reflected in the missing voter, in the number of voters that are eligible to vote that don't vote, and the number of citizens that are eligible to register that don't register. And this creates what we could refer to as a slow crisis that's characterized by shrinking mandates, where voters and victories that we see registered are from a minority of the population, and then there's a silent majority. And so we get a scenario where there's legitimacy that's weakened to govern. So from the day of inauguration, that head of state is aware that they don't have the true support of the majority of eligible voters within that population.
How much of what you just said applies to Tanzania?
Well, it's hard to say because the Tanzania figures are disputed. So had they not been disputed, then they would be the figures that we can extend this argument to, because when we talk about the missing voters, we're looking at official figures, or at least verified figures, or figures from credible sources that will tell us how many registered voters are there within the country, how many of those registered voters actually turned up for polling day, and based on that number. So if you look at countries like Gabon, for example, where the turnout was quite impressive, based on those stats and those data, we can tell whether there's a strong mandate for whoever emerges victorious. But for countries where the figures are disputed, it leaves so much room for speculative analysis.
Yeah. But perhaps just to stay with you quickly on this, Dr. Ndou, and I like that you bring up the Gabon example. Turnout was above 70% there. But more interestingly is that Gabon experienced a coup in 2023, less than 2 years ago, and it was able to hold such successful elections. I guess the question then is, do we see a rise in a trend of democratizing following coups, particularly in the Sahel region, where we've experienced more than 7 coups in the last 15 years, just in that region on the continent alone?
Just to be clear, the question is directed at me so that
Yes.
I don't speak for everyone.
Yes, that's for you.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you. Okay, so with Gabon, so it's one of the key factors really that we've noticed across the continent, where enhanced trust in the systems encourages people to participate. So the more they trust the system, the more they have transparent data, the more there's effective communication, the more empowered citizens feel to express their will through voting. But as trust declines in different contexts, then voters become disengaged. They feel as though their participation won't make any difference. So with instances where there's been a coup, there is a sense that something has shifted or something has transformed in a fundamental way. So it's sort of an expression of hope to say, let's try this one more time. So trust is a big factor. Data is a big factor. Stronger institutions is a factor. Transparency, especially, and how election management bodies handle communication with the broader public. So if we look at countries like Malawi, the processes were not perfect, but there was so much more transparent, preemptive communication, and very clear lines of updating the public on the process throughout. So that made people feel like they can trust the process more. So I think Gabon is really a combination of those factors.
Yeah. Farai, I want to bring you in here. There were 2 elections on the continent where opposition parties, and particularly the main opposition, were either arrested or barred from participating. And it was the Ivory Coast and, more famously so, Tanzania. Might well say that Uganda has an election coming up as well. It will be quite interesting to see if Bobi Wine is allowed to contest freely and fairly this time around. But there seems to be a throttling and a stifling of opposition participation in these elections. And that, as Dr. Ndou said, takes away from the credibility of it. And that's quite important for democratic sanctity. Let's talk about this throttling of opposition parties on the continent. What can be done to ensure that we allow oppositions to freely, fairly contest and also to campaign without being persecuted? Let's see if we can get your audio perhaps sorted out. In the meantime, Chris, do you have a view on the question of opposition participation?
Well, yes, I do. And before that, I wanted to also add to what Dr. Ndou was saying about Gabon. It's not just those factors alone. I think a key factor in the case of Gabon, or so many voters coming out is the satisfaction people had of participating for the first time in over 50 years in an election that did not have the Bongo family on the ballot. So there was a renewal of hope in that particular elections, even though a former military strongman who was involved with the last Bongo president was the major contender. So I think it's just that relief. Imagine what it would be like, for example, in Cameroon, if there's going to be elections there in the future without a Paul Biya on the ballot. It will be the first time for a lot of people who are above 40 years in that country. So that kind of a factor can be a big one in terms of defeating voter apathy that have always trailed elections in the continent. Now, to your question on...
Can I pause you on that just very quickly, Chris, very quickly, and I think quite importantly, just on the Gabon question. When Ali Bongo was removed from office by a coup in 2023, it was widely welcomed by the Gabonese people. But what we typically see is that military juntas and or military transitional governments typically don't hold on to credibility for a very long time. In fact, they try to delay elections for as long as they possibly can. We're seeing that play out in the instance now in the Sahel region as well, with Mali and Niger, for instance, and perhaps even Burkina Faso being an example under Captain Traoré there, where there seems to be no appetite to have a democratic, free and fair electoral process take place. But Gabon seems to be a different case. It seems as though that the military rule was able to garner and hold on to that credibility. What was different about it?
Well, I think that they were very clear. They wanted that, but remember also the person who, the general who took over, quickly transitioned and took part in the elections, and he was seen as popular candidate. I think that the whole sentiment and democratic dynasty sentiment against the Bongo family was a bigger factor than any other consideration. Even if the military are delayed, and oftentimes, like you said, they actually end up worse than the governments, the civilian governments that they topple in terms of corruption and even poor governance and their inability to deal with the security question that they claim bring them to power. But in the case of Gabon, apart from the fact that the general quickly committed to early transition, even though he was part of he was on the ballot, the anti-Bongo sentiment is a huge factor in garnering support for people, keeping them engaged, especially when you add the anti-French sentiment to the mix.
Yeah. I want to bring you back into the conversation, Farai. Hopefully we can hear you this time, but I do have a different question for you. And that is on a point that was earlier made by Dr. Ndou, that what we have on the continent is weak institutions and strong men. Now, Samia Hassan is not a strong man, but she seems to be governing over a country right now where the election results are being disputed, and the military and police were unleashed on the people, so much so that a commission has now been instituted to investigate post-elections political killings in the country. Is Tanzania an example of that trend of weak institutions and strong men? Farai, we seemingly still can't hear you. Oh, seems like we don't have Farai there. Well, we're going to try and fix that audio connection once again, and hopefully we can hear him this time around. Dr. Ndou, are our democratic processes credible? Generally on the continent, that is.
Generally, no. Because again of several factors, but weak institutions is right at the top. Because democratic processes rely on a lot of stewardship. There is a level to which certain institutions safeguard certain democratic principles, processes, values, and systems. And so when those institutions are weak, when they are state captured, And when you have systems of patronage on the continent, and you have those key institutions being headed by individuals that are handpicked, it means that their loyalty, at least the extent to which they are able to execute their role, is compromised right from the beginning. So in general, no, we don't have strong democracies. And that's part of what has contributed to a pattern of coups on the continent, conflict on the continent. Currently, there are about 35 armed conflicts that are happening across the continent, including militias within countries across borders spilling over. So a lot of those conflicts are also historical, because any conflict is a moment of history. So all the issues that we have in different countries that involve unresolved grievances around elections, unresolved calls for constitutionalism, unresolved questions around reforms, they all simmer, and during elections, they tend to escalate. And we see that in electoral violence, we see that in disputed elections. And also we see that in coalitions, coalitions being the manifestation of elites bargaining amongst themselves to govern over their constituents.
Yeah. Perhaps I'll ask you this last question as we close off, Chris. And it's a largely fantastical question, really. It plays into political fantasy, but it's one worth exploring nonetheless. I once heard somebody postulate the idea that Africa would see more transformative and credible elections if most, if not all, African nation states coordinate and align their elections to all happen in the same year, roughly around the same time. Then you'll see sort of the political energy galvanized and spread across the continent as a ripple effect. It's, again, highly impossible for that to ever happen. But do you think it would have the sort of effect that the postulant thought it would?
No, because this postulant is diagnosing the symptoms, right, and not diagnosing the core of the problem. What we are practicing is what many refer to as electoral democracy or electocracy, where we focus on just periodic elections as a measure of democracy. There are other more substantive issues that determine whether how mature a country can be democratically, and how that can lead to development, which can then in turn lead back to sustaining democracy. Fundamentally, the problem we have is the fact that we do not have African states. We have states in Africa that were imposed, and these states were imposed because there were no social contracts between states and citizens. That's why Dr. Ndou talks about that disconnect between states and citizens that lead to voter apathy. So the real solution would be for us to begin to revisit the question of state formation, have social contracts that are negotiated between states and citizens, where citizens and states decide the kind of political system to have, whether be it a liberal democracy or social democracy. And from then on, when people buy into a system, they become the safeguards of that particular system because they feel it's theirs.
Yeah. As the kids would say, that's a fire line. I'm going to put that on a T-shirt. We do not have African states. We have states in Africa that have been imposed on Africa. Thank you so much for that. Really do appreciate it. Dr. Ndou, political campaign expert, as well as Professor Chris Isike, an international relations expert. Thank you so much for that. Thank you as well to Farai Ian, who we were unable to hear due to an audio connectivity issue there.